radioisotope is an isotope that gives off energy or parts. Yesterday I said the two most common, the average, is those. But depending on the environment, you can also make these two types of cesium. They're very common. This type of iodine, very common. And this cadmium, I can't remember the right number. If somebody wants to Google common cesium radioisotope, silence in the front. If somebody wants to Google common cesium radioisotope, we'll get the right number. I think it's 119, but I could be off. So we call them radioisotopes if they are isotopes that give off radioactivity. Another bit of review from yesterday, where we're going to pick up today, is that the reaction can get away from you like sparks igniting firecrackers that ignite sparks, that ignite firecrackers, that ignite sparks. The reaction can get away from you, the chain reaction, unless you control both of the risk factors, the heat and the neutrons. I did not tell you yesterday the two generic terms. Now I'm adding them today. Moderator is anything which helps you soak up neutrons, that helps you slow the rate of the reactions. And coolant is anything that helps you take away the heat. It's usually water. That keeps your core from overheating, keeps your fuel from getting too hot. You'll notice my moderator is written in green, like the control rods of boron, which are also green here. And you'll notice my coolant is written in blue, like all the cold water in this system. It's color-coded so that you'll identify them in the drawing that you made yesterday. So I've added moderator, I've added coolant, I've added radioisotope, and I've given you more examples of radioactive decay products. No, I'm sorry. It was a bad week for it. So that process of radioisotopes falling apart, that's called radioactive decay, number 37. Radioactive decay is when parts fall off. And I'm going to leave it at that. Number 38 is about the nuclear fuel cycle. So how you enrich the uranium, first of all, and then how the uranium becomes radioactive waste, meaning you change uranium into other stuff that's more radioactive. Did we talk about that yesterday, that the radioactive waste is more radioactive than the fuel was? So I've effectively tickled number 37, number 38. How can I help you?
Can you take away neutrons from the uranium-238 to make it radioactive? Or
I suppose you could, but it's much more difficult than to add them into 235. Yes?
Is the reason that nuclear or radioactive decay products are more radioactive because it's not being cooled, or
no?
As it continues to.
Diego might know why.
Can't they hold less?
That's right. Smaller atoms can hold less extra neutrons. So all those additional neutrons in uranium were relatively stable. Not very likely that they would fall off. But like Diego says, when you take that big atom and you break it into two smaller ones, those small ones really cannot hold nearly as many extra parts. The ratio of extra part carrying capacity shrinks when you make smaller atoms. And so those extra neutrons are just not going to distribute into smaller atoms successfully. They'll have to fall off faster. Yes?
Just to clarify, the enrichment process defines both the adding of a neutron to 235, and the increasing of the amount to 235.
No. The enrichment process is only the latter part of your question, shaving off the more common 238 so the 235 becomes a higher percentage of your fuel.
Just separate.
That is the fission reaction.
Oh, I see. The 235 we bump up one electron and then
One neutron you meant. Yes?
How do you attach a neutron to
Voodoo magic.
Like a really small can.
Yes.
Yeah, did they use leprechauns?
So it's just something super complicated that you're not really familiar with.
I can help you, actually. I'm going to wait for the kids to finish their helping each other. And I'll get to your question in a minute. You use something which emits neutrons. So you have basically a highly radioactive neutron emitter, something which itself is more radioactive than the fuel. So you can actually use some of this stuff, which you know ain't going to hold neutrons for very long, as the initial spark to shake up the 235. Make sense?
Yeah.
Your question.
What's the difference between fission and fusion?
Fission, fusion. Fusion, just on the edge of becoming doable. I met a dude in Nevada rock climbing. Everybody I meet rock climbing is in the energy industry, by the way. I met some people that design the dams for the tar oil places in Canada. The last time I was climbing at Red Rock, Nevada. And this time I met some nerd engineer dude from San Diego that works on all this top secret nuclear power plant, nuclear weapon stuff. And his job is to build like the pumps that manage the water flow specific to fusion plants that he says are like, they're just putting the finishing touches on it. They're like, we're pretty much ready to go, but we want to be ready for the market. So they're like getting it really tight. Apparently fusion is going to be a viable energy source in your lifetime. And coincidentally, it's much safer than all this, so the death bells are ringing for fission plants.
Does it have a smaller land footprint for fusion?
Yeah, but the secret is that fusion requires a fuel source. I think you start with helium or hydrogen or heavy water. You start with tritium. So when you shut off the tritium, it's like turning off the gasoline to your car. It stops running. So there is an inherently obvious, simple safety mechanism, which is cut the fuel. And so unlike these that are like, oh my God, the snowball, we got to run, fusion plants are much safer because you can just turn it off. Hold on. Question?
I was just going to ask, because you already answered it, I was going to say how much more volatile is fusion?
Less volatile.
Wait, that's a fission?
This is fission. You're splitting atoms. See? Splitting.
That's fission.
This is the same thing. This is the chemistry that happens in these fuel rods.
Oh, okay.
It's a different reaction.
Hey everybody, I guess I didn't tell you that this is the chemical reaction that gives off the energy to heat this water and stuff. These are the fuel rods! Fuel! Okay. No, I moved really fast, I understand. Now, if there are no other questions left about this, Rotman, my God. If there are no other questions left about this, No? Is that a question for me?
Yeah, well, what does it say after 3 9?
Oh! When I told you it's a lot of energy, I did a little Googling after your class. 1 pound of uranium gives you 3 million times the energy of 1 pound of coal. So when I tell people that it's a lot of energy, to put it in perspective, it's 3 million times more energy by weight than you get out of coal. Yeah.
Where does uranium move down?
All over the place, in the ground. Carpinteria has it.
Are these plants running all the time, or do
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, whenever they need electricity.
How can 300 times more? That's not. That's only like 10%.
Well, on the flip side, there's a lot of coal. And all you got to do is light it on fire. So, the diagram for how to do this with coal is coal plus match, steam, and so on. This is a highly simplified schematic, so the actual engineering of this is a big whoop. That's why. Yeah.
So you said that they're pretty close to being able to harness fusion energy. Is what they're on right now trying to get the magnetic field for like to make a small enough magnetic, area?
If the guy had told me, he would have had to kill me.
Aren't they doing it at MIT?
He works in Sandugi. I don't know. Okay. Oh my God.
Sorry. Okay, so in
I'm
terms
curious.
of the fuel rods and the control rods then, so because the control rods are constant, one of those has fuels then, and then the control rod, I don't know, I guess I'm still trying to use what each of those do.
Fuel rod has fuel, which makes heat.
Okay.
Control rod comes in to soak up neutrons and stop the reactions. If you don't soak up the neutrons, sparks and firecrackers make more reaction.
Okay.
So the control rods are used to moderate the amount of reaction.
So it's just enough, and then that just enough is okay, got it.
Now I will continue. Remember that radioactivity is when an atom gives off energy or parts. A lot of people worry about radioactivity. They say, oh my God, aren't those glow-in-the-dark spots on my watch radioactive? And the answer is yes, they are. And people say, oh my God, aren't cell phones full of radioactive metals? And the answer is, well, yes. But that's like saying, isn't drinking out of plastic toxic? Well, yes, but that's only half the question. It's how much. Radioactivity is one of those things where everything is radioactive. Newsflash, you're radioactive, and so am I. By the way, we are currently receiving radioactivity from space right now. You and me just chilling right here. And if you get unfiltered light from the sun, that's even more radioactivity. So it's not a question of if radioactive, it's a question of how much radioactive. Everybody please take out your reading packet. If you don't have it, you'll have to look at someone else's for a moment. And look at the back page of your reading packet, please. The back page of your reading packet is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting things that I've ever seen in my readings for this class. You realize that I have to read 1 million articles for every one that you get. I get every type of email, and I read so many science news sort of things. But this is an extremely valuable resource to contextualize the dosages of radioactivity that people see. if you'll notice, there's a whole glob of squares, and then that, please look up, is put into perspective relative to other blocks, put into perspective relative to other blocks, compared to how much you got at Chernobyl. You see, we measure the units of radioactivity in picosieverts, millisieverts, and sieverts. So millionths, thousandths, and singles. I highly recommend that you just compare these numbers, because it helps you put into context just how much radioactivity we're talking about. Everything's radioactive. You might be surprised to know that eating bananas raises your chances of being exposed to radioactivity, because bananas are radioactive. So does snuggling with another human, because they're a little radioactive. In comparison, getting an X-ray is like thousands of snuggle sessions. And an X-ray is about 2 days of life. So if you live 2 days longer, that's about the same as getting an X-ray. That's how much exposure an X-ray is. What you get just being alive for a couple days. Right now, you're getting some radioactivity. It's called the background rate, like what's just around. 2 days worth is what you get from an X-ray. Okay? So like, yeah, X-rays are bad, but you know, living 2 days longer is just as bad in terms of radioactivity. What I want you to do with this chart is to just sort of make the comparisons. Because everybody should freak out about radioactivity, that's true, but you should know what you're freaking out about. Working inside of a nuclear power plant, that's bad. Nuclear meltdowns, those are really bad. Fukushima was not that bad compared to Chernobyl. Fukushima, for you, as an American, all the way over here, with all that other space and water in the middle, is really not a big whoop. People need to wear more aluminum hats if they're worried about Fukushima. I mean to say, that's for crazies. It's just not enough radioactivity to seriously affect you. That's like being out in the sun one more day or something. Yeah. So you can see that there are just, you know, basic exposures. So look, I want to talk about this radioactivity thing. It's a game of statistics, a game of odds. You guys know how Russian roulette works? You put a loaded cartridge inside of a revolver and you spin the chambers. And when you pull the trigger, the firing pin falls onto probably an empty chamber. But of course, the more you pull the trigger, the better your chances of hitting that cartridge and putting the projectile through your skull, right? Everybody knows how it works. You've heard about the game of Russian roulette, you know what I'm talking about? Now, radioactivity is like Russian roulette. When you expose yourself to radioactivity, you just raise the chances because you're repeating the experiment. But I have to stress that it's not very likely that radioactivity will harm you. The problem with radioactivity is that the energy, or the subatomic parts, will affect chemical bonds that make a difference to your survival. Okay? Now, I want to break that down. Because first of all, you can write these down. There's like not very good chances. Each of these is like 1 in a gajillion. Almost every single atom in your body will not change a bond if it's struck by radioactivity. Second, if the bond does change, it probably won't matter. Here's another 1 in a billion chance. Because most chemicals in your body are not that critical to your functions. So you lose one lipid in the lipid bilayer of your cells, the other ones just move over and it doesn't matter. You guys know what I mean by that? You're made of quadrillions or more of chemicals, millions of millions for all I know. And most of those, if a chemical bond breaks, you're not going to get sick because that single chemical was not a big deal. So here comes another 1 in a million chance. Maybe you actually put radiation to an important chemical like DNA. But that probably doesn't matter either, because most of the DNA is not used by your cells. So here comes another 1 in a million chance. Radioactivity hits critical DNA in a cell. That's very rare. But most of the time, if it messes up the cell, you know what your body will do? Just eat that cell and make a new one. Yep. Now, if that cell manages to survive, but has a flaw, chances are, who cares? Still not a big deal. Because you've got trillions of cells. And most of them cannot affect your organism. It's like, oh, this one muscle cell isn't doing the right stuff. Who cares? Beautiful muscle cells at work. All around it. So maybe that DNA affects the growth or regulation of growth of a cell and you get a tumor. Who cares? Most tumors are benign. This is what I mean about 1 in a billion chance of 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 1 in a billion chance. You have to affect chemical bonds in DNA that is actually used in that cell in a way that the cell survives, but begins to grow out of control, and that tumor affects your basic functions. Those are 1 in a billion chances each time, or 1 in a trillion chances each time. So now you're saying 1 in a trillion chance. You can just run amok with radioactivity. Sure, it's possible that 1 in a trillion times you could just get cancer right now from radioactivity around us. But it's not very likely. So the question about radioactivity is how much you raise your exposure. You understand what I'm saying? How many times you pull the trigger. And you know, you can afford to pull the trigger a whole lot because the odds are better than 1 in 6. They're 1 in like 6 trillions or something. Do you understand my math here? Am I boring you with my exaggeration? One really good way to raise that is called radioactivity poisoning. You should write this down. That's when radioactive isotopes are stored in your body.
Can you explain the different types of radiation, like alpha and
Wait a minute. You see, if Kyla's desk is radioactive, who gives a crap? She's only sitting at that desk for 51 minutes a day or something. But if she were to put radioactive isotopes inside her body, that will go everywhere she is, and so that really is bad. Radioactive poisoning is very dangerous because your cells don't know the difference between the good isotope and the bad one. Have you guys heard of thyroid cancer from people exposed to radioactivity? People freak out after Fukushima. Everybody was buying these pills so they wouldn't get thyroid cancer. That's because your thyroid loves iodine. And if there's the radioactive type of iodine, your thyroid still loves it. And now you're packing a whole bunch of radioactive material inside your body. So the dangerous part is when that radioactivity lives inside of you. That really raises the odds. Because you're carrying that energy source and that source of little parts everywhere you go. This is radioactivity poisoning. That is actually kind of bad. To eat and then store radioactivity, that's bad. You know, if you eat uranium, you'll probably poop it out. So that's only bad while it's working its way through the straw. But if you eat radioactive iodine, you'll digest that and store it all in one place, your thyroid. So you've got very good chances that your thyroid will develop cancer if the iodine is all living in one little tiny spot in your neck. Yeah.
So is that why eating certain foods that might be radioactive is potentially dangerous?
Yeah, exactly. So at Chernobyl, the government told everybody, you really shouldn't eat
Only animals?
the stuff that soaks up radioactivity. But the people in Belarus had a very traditional diet of mushrooms, fish, and wild berries. You know which things in nature soak up radioactivity? So they thought that Moscow was trying to wipe out their culture. You know how the boy who cries wolf, if the government lies to you, you're not likely to believe them? So all the Belarusians were like, we're hip to your scam. You're just trying to wreck our culture. So they had jam fairs to preserve their wild fruits in traditional preparations. Like, hey guys, hold on to your Belarusian identity. And they were all passing around radioactive poisoning.
They also, I saw a little TV show where they were hunting radioactive animals around Chernobyl.
Yeah, Chernobyl's the best wildlife refuge in Europe right now. Because they've had no people for 30, 40 years. So in all the exclusion zones where people are only allowed for limited time or not allowed at all, the wildlife is taking over. It's like the Garden of Eden.
Are they affected by it?
Yes. Come on. Yes. Yes. Well, you go from a safe isotope, which is your boring old traditional iodine, but if you add parts to it, it's now unstable and will lose those parts. Remember that the whole point of this is that these big atoms break into smaller ones that are loaded with extra baggage, the extra neutrons. Do you understand me?
Yeah.
Yes.
So that might really be the only radioactive element that you can eat and then keep. But you can eat all these heavy metals, but you just probably.
It's one of the ones that you store most preferentially. So out of your diet, iodine going in to iodine coming out is almost zero coming out. You store little bits of everything you eat. But a lot of that stuff your cells don't really love. Iodine, your body hoards. Huh? I can't hear you.
Why is it important? Why is it important?
Oh, I don't know. Something to do with hormone. I don't know, man.
Some fiction people don't get enough iodine.
Yes. Okay.
Wait, no, I have.
They turn into dogs.
Google. Okay. I got to move on. I want to remind you, as some of you were writing and the rest of you were tuning me out, that radioactivity poisoning is when you preferentially store the radioactive isotopes. That's going to really raise the odds of that 1 in a million, 1 in a million, 1 in a million thing. And let me remind you again, just like toxicity, it's not about whether or not, it's about how much. When reactors break, that's a lot. So let's go break some reactors. You've got to remember, look at how much they spent on concrete. Just look at that picture for a minute. There's one thing that's a really big priority. You can tell how much money they spent on concrete. Does everybody see what the big priority is? Getting rid of the heat. Remember we talked about that? You regulate the safety two ways. Control the neutrons and shed the heat. Remember that? Did I tell you yesterday how San Onofre almost blew up this year? They got a barnacle stuck in the cold water intake. They actually got a bunch of barnacles stuck in the barnacles. So watch what happens. This is a visual. If you're not focusing, you'll fail to understand a critical issue. No cold water comes in, so no condensation forms. So no cold water forms. So all of this becomes steam but never comes back as water. So these go dry. So they can't shed the heat and hot water comes back to get heated again. Meltdown. Understand this?
Have they fixed it?
At San Onofre, they were like, guys, we don't have any condensation. Then they're like, guys, we don't have any water in the secondary loop. So it's cool. As the reactor started to heat up, they go to plan B. They put in the control rods, backup supply of coolant. Everything worked out fine. You're okay, I'm okay. The boobs are okay. But they got, kind of close.
Would that have affected us?
Yeah, how big was the fallout zone, dude?
Depending on how big the problem was, it could have affected us. It's not about a yes or no, it's how much. So that would just depend on how much radioactivity had spilled. Now, when you don't have the coolant, things get hot. When things get hot, radioactivity grows because you're giving off more parts because there's a lot of reactions, right? So look, let's go break some reactors. You'll want to write these down. This is number 40, I believe. Raise your hand if you're absent. And nobody else? Nobody but Coop Dog, huh? Yeah.
Is there a reason why the reactors don't have some sort of fallout? Not like in case the water stopped flowing type thing, but if there is a meltdown, why don't they put 100-meter or whatever, however long, 600-meter, the salt mountain, lead tube that you can just pull a lever and it would fall into?
Pretty much cost, but actually there are reactors that are built over giant pools of water, so that the meltdown eventually is cooled inherently by falling. Canada has all of these inherent safety systems. The flip side is you still want to keep everything contained and you still want to make it possible to clean up after. So it's kind of tricky to plan for the total worst, because that's a ton of investment that might make it hard to deal with anything less than the total worst. But it's a good question. I mean, you could always make them safer. And this is pretty generic. This is a highly simplified drawing. There are safety systems for the safety system for the backup of the safety system for the backup. There's a great deal of redundancy already.
I think I was absent when you were talking about this, but kettle bed reactors, can those have meltdowns? Is that a very likely?
Supposedly not. Okay, anybody else want to talk more? Okay, let's get on with this stuff. What happened at 3 Mile Island please look up, is there was a leak. So they ran out of secondary loop water. So the stuff came back hot, and this got too hot. So it vented pressure, and the water level in the primary went down.
And then meltdown.
Then they had a meltdown. That's right, because there was too much heat left. So this is 3 Mile Island. We've already seen a photograph. This is the reactor, the actual reactor. What? In Pennsylvania. And you can see right here, there was too much pressure in the primary loop. Too much water pressure because it was too hot. So when the water vented, it got stuck, and they just ran out of water in that part of the system. So here's a photograph of the reactor core. And I know it's difficult for you to read this, but this should be full of water to take away the heat. And the water was vented out so that all this part was dry to right there. So everything that was exposed melted, went through the water, and got to the bottom. So they did have what's called a partial meltdown. The fuel literally turned to lava, but stayed inside the core. The problem was, radioactive fuel in the air, inside the containment structure. Some radioactivity went through the containment structure, and people have alleged that this caused significant radioactivity in the area, maybe responsible for some cancer clustering around around the plant. Personally, I'm kind of suspicious about that. Because the amount of radioactivity that leaked inside the containment structure was very significant, but the percentage that makes it through the containment structure, probably not too much. In my opinion, 3 Mile Island, very scary close call, but just a close call. Chernobyl, totally different story. Chernobyl was the real deal. And there's something that's very difficult for students to understand. You may have heard that the USSR wasn't exactly wealthy. So when they went nuclear, they built a very simplified version. Please look up. You can make this a whole lot simpler if you put the fuel rods as the source of heat to make the steam. It makes radioactive steam. But if you put the turbine inside the containment structure, what could possibly go wrong?
Nothing.
So the only problem is that with only one heat exchange system, when you run out of water, you go straight to fuel exposed. Their risk was, oh no, we don't have water, and then it's like, oops, you're dry. I thought I had the date written down. I'm sorry. You have to ask your cell phone. It's not in the slide. It's not on there. Sorry. 78, I think. Anybody know? 86. 86.
Wait, so they had the one where it was only.
Yeah, super simple. Super simple, right? Now look, if this was 100 times worse than Hiroshima, how come Hiroshima killed so many more people?
It was an explosion.
Bomb.
It was a bomb. That's a really big difference. A nuclear power plant is not a nuclear bomb. A lot of times when they talk about nuclear disasters, they'll give you a big old mushroom cloud. That is only for the ignorant. A nuclear meltdown is heat and radioactivity, but a bomb is extreme concussive force and ignition. So Hiroshima was, first of all, buildings collapsing on people and people catching on fire. And by the way, there's also radioactive fallout that makes you sick afterward. Hiroshima was also a very busy, crowded city, especially at the time. Historically, Hiroshima was a very, very, am I pronouncing that wrong? Hiroshima was a very, very, very crowded area. Here is no bomb, no concussion. People were standing like 100 feet away and didn't know that there was an accident until they heard the building collapsing from the heat.
Where is it?
This is Chernobyl. Welcome to class. This is Abe's, room 65. My name is Jose.
Long class.
And you can see here, that hole is the reactor. When we say meltdown, those words are very literal. Like a ball of lava melts down into the ground. Like radioactive lava went about 30 or 40 feet below the surface.
How did they stop that?
They haven't.
Magic.
You know, most of the fuel will react pretty quickly. So this stuff went to this stuff, went to this stuff. So you're out of the uranium. There's not a lot of fission happening anymore. That all fizzed already. Fizzed pretty quickly, took a few days. Once you've released all that heat, now you're just left with a bunch of radioactive waste that's still giving off radioactivity, but it's not burning anymore.
Wait, how does the chain reaction stop?
When you run out of fuel. Here's a cheap diagram, and it's easy to understand if you start from your right. Turbine, condenser, water pump. Water goes back to the second pump that takes it over to the rods. The rods make steam that goes through the separator and spins the turbine. So the water is condensed, back to steam, condensed, back to steam. All that is in the containment structure. Until your containment structure melts on your head and falls in. They built this amazing, large containment structure with this huge concrete plug called the bioshield. And the walls that were holding it up turned to lava, and the thing went, and that turned to lava. And then all that stuff was just smoke in the air. Anybody knows what happens when air gets hot?
Right.
Rises? Anybody know what happens when air gets really, really hot?
Explodes.
It rises really high. So the fallout got into the immediate area right away. So within a day, they had evacuated all the people out of the area. Something like 7 million people evacuated in like 24 hours. If you go back to the actual exclusion zone, the area where nobody is allowed, you know, like people like dropped their wallets and kept running, and there's wallets on the ground. Like there was this myth during some of the Soviet era that you could break in and steal stuff, and so there's all these like thieves that have like lumps because they went back to get stuff.
It really like messed them up that bad.
I don't know. It didn't take too long. The government pretty much allowed a very limited amount of time to pass before people could go in and get all their stuff back. Yeah, I mean, it's still not a good thing. I'm sure that nobody's excited about it.
So it'll be this bad for a long time.
It follows to reason, yeah. I'm not really an expert on timing.
Until the half-life.
When that fallout got high enough, the wind current started to spread it around town, but it was really hot. So when that stuff got into the jet stream, then it went global. Belarus? Belarus is part of the Soviet Republic, Eastern Caucasus states, I believe. What? Yeah. But it is an Eastern Caucasus state, right? One of the eastern half of the Caucasus range.
So it's spread dramatically.
Yeah, it does. And it,
So scary.
yeah, so within 3 days, half of humanity had registered additional radioactivity exposure. Remember, that's not a lot. It's like an extra X-ray, which is like living a couple days more of sunlight. But for the poor people that lived nearby, it was a whole lot. Remember, the government was like, hey, you guys, don't go outside. And they're like, yeah, right, you just don't want us to see. So everybody goes outside to look at what the government was hiding. And then the government is like, please, there's radioactive fallout. Radioactivity is absorbed by mushrooms, fish, and wild fruit. And all the Belarusians are like, aha, you don't like our culture. We'll show you. And so there was this like rebel grassroots movement of Belarusians that ate extra fish and mushrooms and wild fruit.
Did they get cancer?
I mean, it's not a direct line, but they raised their odds. Because it's not like radioactivity gives you cancer. There's the question in the middle about the statistics, yes. Someday I can show you an animation of that cloud. But now we've got to talk about waste disposal. Because the really sad news is, we don't have any plan. There's no place to put it.
Give it to the Canadians.
There is no place to manage our radioactive waste right now.
Is this enough?
Yeah. Boys, quiet. The current plan is pretty much to leave it outside. There's a lot of facilities that have high-level waste. It's mostly in underground tanks or in above-ground moderated storage. Fuel rods are the biggest problem. Because remember, fuel rods, if they're used up, are the most radioactive part of this whole conversation. You've got, like Diego was saying, small atoms that can't hold all the extra parts in the spent fuel rods. The federal government is now responsible for providing a place because of this law, the NWPA. NWPA. And the government has no place to put it. We thought we would put it in Yucca Mountain because everybody hates Nevada. Yucca Mountain seemed like a pretty good spot. You know, there's not a lot of people nearby. It's underneath a giant rock of granite. You can make tunnels in it because it used to be a mine. So people could drive in all the waste and then could keep an eye on it. And it was really going to happen. And all the states were like, yeah, we got a place, let's do it. And Nevada was like, And everybody's like, sorry, Nevada, someone's got to lose. And it's like, not us, not us. And everybody's like, yeah, it's Nevada. And then Nevada found good science in their favor. They're like, oh, by the way, earthquake fault, high groundwater. And everybody in the U.S. goes, oh, back to the drawing board. In your reading packet, there's an amazing story about the Go-Shoot Indians who, like many Indians, were kicked off their historical land and forced to live in some remote land butthole called the Go-Shoot Indian Reservation. Is it the Go-Shoots?
It was in Utah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Go-Shoot.
Yeah. So in Utah, they're like they live in some like really not cool zone in Utah. As an Indian tribe, they're not really doing so well. And they heard like, wait, you guys are looking for a place to store your radioactive material? You'll pay for that? And the Go-Shoot is a very small tribe, and there's a lot of radioactive waste. So somebody like brought out a calculator, and they're like, wait, how many pounds? How much per pound per year? And so they sent out sales reps to go to all the radioactive facilities, and they're like, we'll take all your waste. How much? And everybody was like, cha-ching! And they figured out that each Go-Shoot was going to become like a gajillionaire. So they're like, we got this. You can bring all your radioactive material to the Go-Shoot reservation. And the funny thing about giving native tribes or native groups political sovereignty is that's their country in our country, basically. So we're like, hey, you're not allowed to leave that stuff piled up out there. And they're like, try to stop me. It's my res. And they don't want to live there. They're not worried about it. With that much money, they were going to move all the Go-Shoot into nice private homes in Salt Lake or something. So there was this like really interesting political battle. Hold on a second. Where they forced the Go-Shoot to cancel their plans by passing a bunch of laws that forbid you to drive radioactive material on Utah's highways, through their trains, or onto their airstrips. And so all the Go-Shoot spent all this money, and then they're like, oh, they go back to the reservation and get bummed again.
That's so sad.
Yeah.